Today, we look at the air that we breathe. Around the globe, citizens' health and nations' fortunes are being affected by air pollution. So much so, say campaigners, we have to act now. We'll examine their arguments. And looking into the virtual future, could this, a VR headset, finally allow virtual reality to go beyond gaming, to become a mass market reality? I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. Smog hanging over cities is a familiar and obvious form of air pollution. We've all seen images of people battling through thick smog in cities in China and India. But some of the other countries being warned about poor air quality might surprise you. Researchers argue that mature economies like Germany, the United Kingdom and the United States are losing tens of billions of dollars a year through lost workdays and welfare costs linked to dirty air. In London, one group of campaigners has mounted a legal challenge against the British government over what they say is inadequate action plan to tackle air pollution. For Insight, our correspondent Sarah Firth has braved the London air to investigate.
In cities across the world, air pollution is rising at an alarming rate.
I don't send my children to the park to play. I don't want them to fall ill and get fever or cough because of the dust in the park.
Over the last 5 years, outdoor pollution has risen, with billions of people around the world exposed to dangerous air.
My advice to those around me is to not stay in Beijing if you can. When going outside, it's better to wear a facial mask. Even though I often forget about it, I still remind my family and friends.
Air pollution's costing the world trillions of dollars a year and severely impeding development in many countries. Away from the financial burden this pollution is placing on countries, there's a much more serious price being paid by some. Worldwide air pollution now kills 5.5 million people a year prematurely. More than half those deaths occur in China and other developing economies in Asia. And air pollution's costing the global economy some $5 trillion annually. The main culprit's the emission of small particles from power plants, factories, from the burning of coal and wood, and in developed countries, vehicle exhaust emissions are still a major factor. Often described as the invisible killer, in some major cities like here in London, air pollution isn't always visible to the naked eye, even when you're next to a really heavily congested road. Now, it's why equipment like this is so important. This monitors the levels of air pollution, and it enables us to look and see on a daily basis just how bad air pollution really is. Now, campaigners are saying that monitoring is not enough, and they're calling on the government to take some more concrete action. Simon Alcock works for environmental law firm Client Earth. In mid-October, they'll be before judges at a British High Court, who will consider their legal challenge against the UK government's pollution action plan.
Well, I think it's a scandal that 40,000 people in our country die prematurely from something that we know the solution to.
The British government says it's spending billions to improve air quality, but concedes the capital will have to wait until at least 2025 before air quality levels are safe. And in the meantime, the consequences for the population are serious.
I would say this is a major public health issue, really. Second to only smoking, which we've started to take seriously over the past 10-20 years. And this is just as serious, really, in its own way. And yes, there are countries that are worse than us, but there's a lot of countries that are better than us too. And why should we be in this, in 2016, why should we put our children at risk when we're walking around in our towns and cities?
Why don't you think there's been more of a public outcry about this if the impact is so huge?
Yeah, I think it goes over people's heads because they've heard, unless it's from a doctor or somebody like that, I think they tend not to believe it. But I think if if you talk about everyday life, it's more real to people, and so it could be your child that you're walking to school through a polluted road that is breathing in nitrogen dioxide that's going to affect their lungs, or it could be your granddad who's got heart problems because of lived in a polluted area. We now know that this pollution does affect us on a sort of daily basis, and it might not be on our death certificates, but it will play a role.
Around the world, and awareness about the potential dangers of air pollution is growing. Face masks, apps that monitor pollution are all ways that people are individually trying to combat the risk. But the warnings are clear, from Beijing to Brussels, Delhi to Dusseldorf, until governments from both developed and developing nations take even more radical action. People in cities around the world remain at risk from the air they breathe. Sarah Firth reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined by Arib Mohammed, who's a senior campaigner at Greenpeace and leads their air pollution project. Also with us is the data journalist Peter Young, who joins us on a Skype call. Ariba, thanks for being with us today. I thought the Kyoto Protocol had sorted out what governments had to do. Are they ignoring it?
The Kyoto Protocol made governments responsible for carbon emissions, but air quality is something that has been overlooked in cities, especially in urban areas, for a long time now. And this is the reason why we are facing these consequences today. Just because we can't see it, feel it, touch or smell it, especially in cities like London, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
And there is no legal requirement for a government to produce clean air for you and me to breathe?
The government was bound by EU regulations.
Past tense.
Well, now I think it is still bound by it till we decide what it really means to exit the EU. The government was responsible for making sure that air quality was a particular standard.
And is that common around the world? I mean, the United States, similar rules are in place. The rest of Europe, similar rules are in place?
The United States follows the Environmental Protection Agency's laws, which are actually much stringent than what the WHO prescribes. The EU laws are based on WHO standards, but the EPA standards are even higher, which is incidentally the reason why the Volkswagen cars were found out on the Dieselgate scandal.
Right, because of the ability to pollute more than they said they were going to do so.
Yeah.
So governments are acknowledging this. There are rules in place. Are you saying these rules don't go far enough, that the actual specified levels of pollutants should be reduced still further?
So the UK government in particular, for example, has year after year failed to meet the limits on air quality. It's been in breach of EU air standards, which is the reason why Client Earth, like we saw earlier, is suing the British government for not doing enough. This is in particular the particulate matter and the nitrogen and its oxides, which are causing heart strokes and asthma.
Infrequently, just on some days or some parts of days, or are you saying over time?
So every year there's a quota.
Every
year there's a quota that the air quality is supposed to meet, and UK has failed it for the last 4 or 5 years consistently. Earlier this year, it took London 8 days to exhaust its annual limit of nitrogen dioxide. So that's the state of things.
Peter Young can join us on Skype. Peter, thanks for being with us today. You've been compiling data which helps explain this phenomenon on a worldwide basis. Are we right to assume that, say, China is still the most polluted country for air quality?
Right, yes. I mean, well, I think initially it's good to acknowledge that this really is important, that we look at it as a global issue. Of course, that throughout the UK, 13,000 people die a year from air pollution related illnesses. But if you look at it, the worst cases are sort of developing countries, Africa and Asia, and I'm sure everyone sees in the news every day, or almost it seems, just air pollution alerts going through Beijing. I suppose more often we're seeing it now in the UK. In London, for example, now Sadiq Khan, the mayor, has introduced regular sort of air pollution alerts, warnings if they're sort of in breach of limits and particular standards in Paris.
To help us understand this, you've produced a very useful application of data set to a visual mapping, and we've got your app now available to us, and we can see the whole of, well, the whole of the world really. And if I just zoom in, the African continent around the equatorial belt looks pretty bad for air quality, but here we go to move in on the areas in the Far East. This is PM10 concentrations. Just explain what that actually means.
Well, exactly. So it's a type of particle, and I suppose the most commonly used and referenced in terms of its damaging impact on in air pollution. But it's only one of two, and there's another sort of form called PM 2.5, which is something that's recently been looked more into in monitoring stations, and this also is something that's sort of been overlooked because it is actually potentially very lethal as well.
Just explain why sub-Saharan Africa is so bad. Nigeria, for instance, scores pretty poorly on some of these concentrations.
Well, certainly Nigeria, Sudan are really high among the list, as well as other regions, Pakistan, in terms of the amount of cities that are in the top 100. And again, this just comes into sort of the infrastructural problem, because in the West we can sort of look to these targets to attempt to cut them, but as developed nations, but when they're sort of trying to grow their economies as fast as possible, they don't want to sort of put limits on that. And so the impact is being sort of seen through in terms of air pollution.
Ariba Hamid, is it that industry is just unwilling to invest in cleaner air?
I think we have to understand that in urban areas, it is actually cars and transport running on fuels like diesel that is a big part of this problem. Diesel fumes are carcinogenic. The WHO ruled that in 2012. So there is no reason for us to actually going on promoting diesel cars, which are adding to the problem.
So you would advocate that we need more stringent encouragement for people to stop using diesel motor vehicles, what, worldwide?
I would say so.
If they're bad in one place, they're bad all over, right?
Definitely. I mean, there is no dispute that they're a big part of the problem. In Delhi, we've already seen an independent body recommending a ban on registration of all new diesel vehicles because the problem is out of hand. In London, we're not quite there yet, but we know that diesel is a big part of the problem. And that is why Sadiq Khan, the new mayor, is trying to actually price out the most polluting vehicles off our streets.
But there is clean diesel technology around. Are you saying that even the cleanest of diesel engines, with whatever the electronics they apply to them, are still a bad idea and need to be retired?
Well, all I know is that earlier this month actually, there was a test done by an independent agency of all the new models of diesel cars being sold in the UK, and all of them were emitting much more than they say that what's in the lab. So the problem is not only with VW vehicles. This problem of overstating or rather understating the emissions is common with all diesel cars because they're never meeting the real-world emission tests. They are only being tested for emissions in labs, and when you drive it on the street, they're polluting much more.
Peter, when we see your map and see the problems, are the areas which appear to be pollutant-free necessarily clean, or is it just that it's very difficult to get reliable data from some parts of the globe?
Well, yeah, I think the data sort of collection is an issue, but at the same time, I think it's almost the scale of the problem is so large that even if in the apparently sort of less polluted areas, still there, it's often it's sort of in breach of these limits. I mean, Oxford Street in London, I think it was last year named as the most polluted street on Earth. So it's a relative thing, but I mean, it's just the scale of the issue is so large that it may seem other areas are less, but still they're a problem.
Peter Young, Ariba Hamid, thank you both very much.
Thank you very much.
This is Insight. Coming up, a heads up about virtual reality headsets.